In any form of media, the perspectives of the characters are often assigned by their roles. The protagonist is associated by the character being the crux of the story, since we see their perspective all the time. The antagonist is the opposing force that works against our protagonist, applying a black and white element to whatever story is being told. There are many techniques to twist and distort these perspectives though, where it becomes difficult to see who the bad guy really is. In a lot of mainstream media, it's clear and cut who the opposites are. In more experimental projects, it starts to blur, especially when the film focuses on the antagonist instead. At this point, it becomes harder to identify to relate with who is ultimately the bad guy. Imagine if you took The Thing and made the parasitic entity the main character and the humans the bad guys, or if you took Michael Myers from Halloween and we saw from his perspective at all times and Laurie and her friends became the opposing forces. We would get the opposite effects if the roles were reversed. In horror, we would become empowered rather than terrified. In action, we would become weak rather than strong. In drama, we would become husks rather than laying all our emotions on the table. The reversal of roles and expectations aren't explored as much compared to the conventional means of displaying a story because it's really hard to do, on the account of getting the audience, the viewer, or the player to be able to relate and feel moved in whatever capacity. Then if you just made the character someone who was ordinary or normal compared to society standards. Today, I will dive a little bit into a genre of horror known as reverse horror. In horror gaming, we are very often in control of a character placed in situations where they can't fight or have to run, or abide by the rules in order to survive. Some exceptions include games like Resident Evil, Silent Hill, and Fatal Frame, where we always have a means to fight back, even at the risk of death against stronger foes. But imagine for a second if you were Mr. X from Resident Evil 2, or the Ghost from PT or Fatal Frame. Would you feel terrified? No, but you wouldn't feel human either. But what about the role of a serial killer? Someone like Michael Myers or Ghostface? Again, you wouldn't be able to relate to them much because of how disconnected they are from other humans and how closed in they are in regards to letting us see what they're thinking or how they're feeling. Reverse horror has been around for quite some time, in books, in games, in movies. One such example is a movie called Carrie, which is based on a novel by Stephen King. It's about a girl in high school who becomes a target amongst her peers, being harassed, bullied, and tormented throughout her day. At first, we begin to sympathize with her, especially when we get a glimpse into her household and what she has to deal with on a daily basis. Towards the end of the movie, the final nail in the coffin is struck. We then see what was lurking inside her all along, and then all hell breaks loose, and people start dying, and it gets worse from there on. The protagonist has become the horror, the bullies and those who came across her, its victims. The feeling of empowerment is reverse horror's greatest effect, something akin to action, but in a more sinister and twisted context. And there are many other forms of media that provide the same effect. But I think that it is far more potent in gaming, where we're in direct control of our actions. The first game, and I'm sure it's the same for many others, where the term reverse horror was first heard in gaming, was a game called Carrie, a platformer where you take the role of an organism trapped in an underground lab. The forces we come up against are the humans trying to keep us contained, so to speak. We get some insight throughout the game what it is and how it came to be, but then it begs the question, are there more of these? How long would we last if it got out into the world? Questions that are pretty terrifying to think about, given how much we get to see of this creature and what it's truly capable of. We can't relate to it, but we can definitely relate to the feeling of power and how much destruction we can cause when nothing is holding us back. Carrion is one such example, and a fantastic one at that if you're looking for something different. Of course, it's not the only one. I've happened to find a few others that also have a reverse horror twist, where we're the antagonist and where we're the ones in control. You could consider Dead by Daylight a reverse horror game as well, given the fact that you can also play the killer, but because of the random nature of multiplayer, the effect doesn't always work, and from experience can lead to many frustrating sessions, and it no longer becomes a horror game at that point. Personally, reverse horror works much better in a single player environment, where the experience as intended isn't interrupted by random factors. I'll go into a few that I found to be quite enjoyable, and I think that are worth your time. Calm Time is a small indie horror game where your character hosts a dinner party in a cottage outside of town. Everything seems normal, and you have a variety of guests that are waiting for the event to begin. You go into the kitchen and check your assistant. She asks for the knife, and as you give the knife to her, after that, it unravels very quickly, and your motives become quite clear. It then becomes this cat and mouse game where you hunt down all of the attendants that have come to your event. The gameplay is relatively simple, its art style very retro, but the game has a very unsettling atmosphere, especially when you have someone else that's following you. Not that it can harm you anyway, however, it does provide a small window into the character's psyche. In the basement, you find a dead woman chained up, which implies that the character has done this before. Who was the woman? Who knows? But her significance becomes apparent as her apparition constantly appears around the corners of the cottage, and the outside of it too. She also appears next to the people you're trying to kill, almost like a force that's trying to stop you. Nevertheless, you eventually complete your hunt, and then she appears one last time. Your character begins this monologue, ending with liking the sound of the wind, which adds a thin layer to what the character really feels. The fact that he prefers the sound of the wind over the birds chirping suggests that silence is more comforting to him than the company of others. It's a small game with a thin story, but it shows a perspective where we're not just playing a monster we can't even begin to understand, but someone with thoughts and feelings, someone that is plagued or haunted in one way or another. The second example is a game called Happyville Homicide, a slasher 2D game that takes direct inspiration from slashers like Halloween and Nightmare on Elm Street. Our character wears a uniform of sorts and wears a mask. One by one, he starts killing his chosen victims in a number of horrific ways, and part of the game's effect is how detached we become in this perspective. The people he kills come from all different walks of life. The detachment comes from it being our adherence to the rules. Since we're the killer, these people have become the objective. But if we were in the role of a detective, say this character, then we would be finding the one responsible and putting a stop to it. Reverse horror lets us detach ourselves from the care or welfare of others because we are in the shoes of something monstrous, or someone in the shape of a man. We learn more about the killer towards the end of the game, turning out to be a janitor from a high school a year before the events of the game. All of the victims are connected, and it becomes a revenge plot, so to speak, except for one character, who became an accident, which is where Maddie comes in. In the high school segment, we see our killer get ridiculed by all the staff and most of the students. Maddie thanks him for the gift he gave her, possibly being the only person in the school that's been nice to him, and this is important because it develops a layer of sympathy for the killer, where he could have ended up differently if other people had treated him better. However, it only just provides the reason for the actions taking place. The main reason we're playing is for the ability to let go, or to not hold back anymore, which is what reverse horror does. Happyville Homicide is a really good slasher game that can raise questions in regards to your sense of morality, your ability to draw the line, so to speak. It's one thing to detach yourself from your own moral compass when you're merely experiencing the game's narrative, especially in the guise of a monster or a killer. But it's another to act on those impulses, which is where the line gets broken, so you have to be careful not to get too invested in these kind of games. Finally, one more game that tackles reverse horror pretty well, but in a different way, I Live Under Your House, a point-and-click and walking sim horror game where you play as an unknown creature that lives underground. It enjoys its solitude, but is plagued by visions of ghastly spirits in its dreams, and a spirit that waits at the tunnel exits leading outside. The creature we play as talks about the tunnels it digs, and how it always wonders where it came from. We don't get to see what it actually looks like, but we can guess that it may be humanoid in form, and it talks in a manner we can understand. Its true nature is kept a mystery throughout the game, and displays a range of emotions akin to a human. It has wishes and desires not unlike our own, but its unknown nature is also the thing that terrifies us, and the humans that come across it later on. The imagery and the music is really disturbing, and yet we're not exactly scared, but curious. Its lo-fi, cryptic environments and clever use of suggestion and imagery make this small indie game effective in its presentation, showing a monster of sentience that is also capable of extreme terror. The empowerment of this monster comes from its unknown source of strength, and its supposed nature, implying that it is demonic as we see in the end of the game, raising more questions than answers. The game has 3 endings and is rather short. It provides a character that is both terrifying and also sympathetic because of the emotions it conveys, and its desire to understand its place in the world. It's also free, so you have nothing to lose by trying it. Reverse horror done right can be powerful, but it is very hard to find a perfect balance with, when your goal is to move the viewer, the player, or the general audience. But it is something that should be explored more, in whatever media it comes to form in. Horror has many flavors, and this is one of my favorites. I'll provide links to the games in the description so you can check them out as well. I hope I've covered the subject well enough, and it's given you a bit more insight into what reverse horror is. Any comments or feedback are always appreciated. Thank you for watching.